The following story contains supernatural elements, atmospheric horror, and themes of isolation intended for mature audiences who enjoy traditional American folklore and ghost stories. Viewer discretion is advised. Turn off the lights, settle in, and whatever you do, don't answer if something knocks 3 times.
The town of Creston Harbor, Maryland, sits at the edge of the Chesapeake Bay like something the water forgot to swallow. It is the kind of town that appears on no tourist map, earns no mention in travel magazines, and exists mostly in the memories of the people who were born there and never quite managed to leave. The streets are narrow and salt-bitten. The wooden storefronts have been painted and repainted so many times that the colors no longer have names. The boats in the harbor rock with a slow, patient rhythm, as if they have been waiting for something for a very long time. And out beyond the pier, past the crab pots and the rusted channel markers, rising from a slab of black rock that juts into the gray Chesapeake water, stands Harlow Point Lighthouse. It has stood there for 131 years. It has been empty for 70. Elias Croft arrived in Creston Harbor on a Tuesday in late October with $43 in his checking account, a duffel bag of worn clothes, and a printed email confirming his temporary employment with the Maryland Historic Preservation Office. The job description had been simple, almost boring in its language. Site assessment and minor structural documentation of Harlow Point Lighthouse, Creston Harbor, MD. Duration, 3 weeks. Compensation, $2,400 plus housing on site. He had applied on a Thursday night, half expecting nothing. By Friday morning, they had already called him back. The woman on the phone had spoken quickly, almost nervously, as if she were relieved that anyone had applied. He should have noticed that. He didn't. Elias was 28 years old and carried the particular kind of exhaustion that belongs to young men who have worked very hard and still ended up with very little. He had studied architectural history for 2 years at the University of Maryland before the money ran out. He had worked construction, warehouse shifts, 2 separate stints at a call center, and 1 memorable month driving a delivery truck through the Washington, D.C. suburbs at 4 in the morning. He was not a man who frightened easily, largely because he had grown too tired for fear. What frightened him truly deeply was another month behind on rent. So Creston Harbor it was. He parked his truck at the edge of the harbor lot and sat for a moment, looking out at the lighthouse through the windshield. Even from this distance, it had a quality he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't ugly. The structure itself was handsome in the old New England way. White stone with a black iron lantern room at the top, a modest keeper's cottage attached at the base. But there was something about the way it sat on that black rock, separated from the shore by 200 yards of dark water and a narrow wooden causeway, that made it feel less like a building and more like a presence, like something that had decided to stay. The harbor master, a heavy-set man named Pruitt who wore the same expression whether he was angry or merely thinking, handed Elias the key with the minimum possible ceremony. "You staying out there on site?" Pruitt asked. "That's the plan," Elias said. Pruitt looked at him the way a man looks at someone who has just said something mildly foolish. He didn't elaborate. He simply handed over the key, old iron, heavier than it looked, and turned back to his paperwork. In the small diner on Harbor Street, where Elias stopped for coffee before driving his supplies to the causeway, it happened twice more. The woman behind the counter, when he mentioned where he was working, let her smile go still for just a half second before she recovered it. An older fisherman at the counter turned on his stool, studied Elias with dark, careful eyes, and then turned back without a word. He was beginning to notice a pattern. It was there, at the counter, nursing a cup of black coffee and telling himself these people were simply superstitious, that he felt the first tap on his shoulder. He turned. No one was there. The seat behind him was empty. The diner's front door was closed. He set down his cup with careful deliberation and decided not to think about it. The Lighthouse cottage was cold in the particular way of places that have not held warmth in a long time. The furniture, a cot, a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, had been provided by the preservation office and was entirely new, which made it look even stranger against the ancient stone walls. Elias unpacked methodically, laid out his tools and notebooks, and stood at the salt-fogged window looking out at the lamp room above. The lamp itself had not worked since 1954. He had just started a fire in the wood stove and was beginning to feel something almost like comfort when he heard it. From directly above him, from the sealed lamp room at the very top of the lighthouse, up 3 flights of locked iron stairs. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, patient, as if whatever was up there had been waiting 70 years for someone to finally arrive, and was simply, calmly, letting him know that it was aware he had. Elias stood very still in the firelight, his hand frozen on the wood stove handle, and listened to the silence that followed. The kind of silence that feels less like the absence of sound and more like something holding its breath. He thought of the harbor master's expression, the waitress's stilled smile, the fisherman's careful eyes. He thought of the $43 in his checking account. He put another log on the fire. He did not go upstairs, but he also did not sleep. Out on the dark water of the Chesapeake Bay, far beyond where any boat should be, a pale light moved slowly beneath the surface, and then, for just a moment, it stopped, as if it too had noticed that the lighthouse was no longer empty. The logbooks were waiting beneath the floorboards, and they had things to say. Sleep, when it finally came to Elias Croft that first night, arrived the way it does in unfamiliar places, shallow, restless, and easily broken. He dreamed of water, not the violent, crashing kind that men fear in storms, but the slow, dark, patient kind, the water that exists 30 feet below the surface, where light does not reach and sound travels differently and everything moves with a terrible, unhurried grace. He dreamed he was standing at the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, looking up at the wavering gray disk of the sky far above, and that something beside him, something he could not turn his head to see, was also looking up, waiting, counting. He woke at 5:43 in the morning to the sound of the bay wind pressing against the cottage windows, and he lay still for a long moment, staring at the stone ceiling, reorienting himself to the world of solid things. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to orange embers. The room smelled of salt and old wood and something else, something faintly damp that he couldn't source, like the smell of a basement after rain, or a coat that had never fully dried. He sat up, rolled his shoulders, and told himself firmly that 3 knocks in an old stone building meant settling foundations, contracting iron, the ordinary complaints of an aging structure. He had studied enough old buildings to know they were never truly silent. He almost believed it. The work that first morning was straightforward and absorbing enough to quiet his mind. He moved through the cottage with his clipboard and camera, documenting cracked mortar, salt erosion along the window frames, the condition of the original wide plank flooring. It was honest, methodical work, and Elias had always found comfort in the measurable, in things that could be written down and quantified and therefore understood. It was the floor that found him first. He was on his knees in the far corner of the cottage's main room, photographing a section of particularly damaged planking near the north wall, when he noticed that one board rang differently underfoot. Not the soft give of rot, something hollow, deliberate. He pressed it with his palm and the board shifted, not randomly but along a clean line, as if it had been lifted and replaced many times before. He worked his fingers into the gap and pulled. Beneath the board, in a shallow recess cut directly into the stone foundation, lay 3 books. They were wrapped in oilcloth, the old-fashioned kind, dark and waxy, and bound together with a length of tarred twine that had hardened to the consistency of wire. Elias sat back on his heels and looked at them for a long moment before he touched them. Even in the gray morning light filtering through the salt-fogged windows, even before he opened a single page, he understood instinctively that someone had hidden these with great care and very deliberate intention. Not discarded, hidden. There is a difference, and old buildings teach you to feel it. He carried them to the table, unwrapped the oilcloth with careful hands, and opened the first. The handwriting inside was precise and angular, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was considered a mark of character. The ink had faded to a deep brown at the edges of each page but remained legible at the center. On the inside cover, in careful block letters, Harlow Point Lighthouse, Keeper's Log E. Harlow, 1951. Elias exhaled slowly. He reached for his coffee, found it cold, drank it anyway, and began to read. The early entries were unremarkable in the way that honest working life usually is. Edmund Harlow recorded weather patterns, shipping traffic, maintenance tasks, supply deliveries. He wrote about the particular quality of the Chesapeake fog in November, about a family of osprey nesting on the rock below the causeway, about a nor'easter in February of 1952 that kept him confined to the cottage for 11 days and during which he read the complete works of Herman Melville for the second time in his life. He was a careful, observant man, and his writing had a quiet dignity to it, the voice of someone entirely at peace with solitude, who had chosen this life not out of necessity but out of genuine temperamental fit. Elias found himself liking Edmund Harlow quite genuinely before he had finished the first logbook, which made opening the second one harder. The second logbook began in the spring of 1953, and for the first several months the tone remained steady. But somewhere in August, Elias could feel the shift before he could name it, the way the entries became slightly shorter, slightly more careful, as if Harlow were choosing his words with new deliberation. Something changed. August 14, 1953. Harlow wrote, "Observed an unusual light offshore this evening, bearing roughly northeast, perhaps 3/4 of a mile out. No vessel registered in the shipping log for that position or heading. Light was pale, almost bluish, and moved against the current. Watched it for 40 minutes before it submerged. Likely atmospheric. Noted for record. Likely atmospheric." Elias read the phrase twice, hearing in it the same firm, rational reassurance he had offered himself the night before about 3 knocks in an old building. The offshore light appeared again on August 19th, September 3rd, September 17th. Each time, Harlow noted it with increasing precision, the exact bearing, the duration, the quality of the light, the state of the tide. He was a keeper in every sense. He documented what he saw. But the language around the documentation began to shift in ways that were subtle and then not subtle at all. October 2nd, 1953. The light was closer tonight. I watched it from the lamp room with the long glass. I could see, and I write this with full awareness of how it will read. A shape beneath it. Indistinct. Large. I am a rational man and I do not use language carelessly. I am recording what I observed. November 11th, 1953. I have begun to hear something in the evenings. It comes with the tide. A sound at the periphery of hearing, almost like a voice, almost like singing, though I cannot make out words. The sound does not frighten me. That is, perhaps, what frightens me most about it. December 29th, 1953. I looked up the records at the county office in Annapolis last week during my supply run. I found reference to an incident in 1891. A captain named Doyle, a smuggling operation on the bay, 17 men drowned. The lighthouse keeper at the time reported it. I found his name, Aldous Crane. I found also that Aldous Crane disappeared 6 months after his report, in the spring of 1892. His body was never recovered. I do not know why I am writing these two things side by side. I only know that I cannot stop thinking about them. Elias set the logbook down and pressed both hands flat on the table. The cottage was very quiet. Outside, the bay wind moved across the black rocks with a low, continuous moan that he had been hearing for 2 hours and only now fully registered. He picked up the third logbook, the final one. It was thinner than the others, and the entries were shorter, more fragmented, the handwriting less controlled. A man still trying to maintain form while something inside him loosened. The last full entry was dated September 3rd, 1954. I have not slept properly in 3 weeks. The voice knows my name now. I don't know how that is possible. I don't know how to write what I mean when I say I have heard it say my name, clearly, from the water, on a night with no wind. I have written to the preservation office requesting reassignment. I have not received a reply. I am going to go up to the lamp room tonight and look. I have been avoiding it. I think that has been a mistake. I think not looking is worse than looking. I think, and I pray I am wrong, that it is almost time for something, and that I have been here for the counting of it. Below that, in handwriting that was no longer Edmund Harlow's careful penmanship, but something pressed hard and uneven into the page, were 4 words. It knows my name. After that, nothing. The remaining pages of the third logbook were blank. 63 empty pages following for desperate words, like a sentence the world had not allowed him to finish. Elias sat at the table in the cold cottage for a long time. The embers in the wood stove had gone completely dark. The bay wind pressed against the windows with quiet insistence. And from somewhere above him, not the 3 measured knocks of the night before, but something softer, something almost gentle, came the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the lamp room floor, back and forth, the way a man walks when he is keeping watch, the way a man walks when he has been waiting for 70 years, for someone to finally find the books he hid beneath the floor. Elias did not yet know the name of Captain Doyle. He did not yet know what 17 drowned men had cursed into the water of the Chesapeake Bay. But the lighthouse above him did. And it was patient. It had always been patient. 70 years is nothing when you are waiting for the right person to read the right words on the right night. Tomorrow he would go into town. Tomorrow he would find old Vera Hatch. Tonight, the footsteps continued. Steady, unhurried, faithful. And the offshore light returned to its place on the dark water, pale and blue and watching. Speech balloon old Vera had lived in Creston Harbor her entire life. She knew things about the lighthouse that no logbook had ever recorded. And she had been expecting someone to come ask. Creston Harbor in the early morning smelled of salt and diesel and frying bread. And for a few merciful minutes as Elias drove across the narrow causeway and back onto the mainland, the ordinary world reasserted itself with welcome firmness. The sky was the color of old pewter, low and close the way October skies along the Chesapeake tend to be. Not threatening exactly, but serious, like a face that has something important to say and is waiting for the right moment. Crab boats were already moving on the water. A pair of men in orange overalls stood on the dock talking, their breath coming out in small white clouds. A dog barked somewhere on Harbor Street, and the sound was so entirely and comfortingly normal that Elias felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized had been clenched tight since the night before. He parked outside the diner, went in, and ordered eggs and toast and the largest coffee they would sell him. He ate slowly and deliberately, the logbooks sitting on the table beside him in their oilcloth wrapping, and he thought with the careful discipline of a man who has trained himself not to panic. The facts, as he understood them, were these. Edmund Harlow had been the lighthouse keeper at Harlow Point from 1951 until his disappearance in September of 1954. He had documented a series of increasingly disturbing experiences in the months before he vanished. An unexplained offshore light, a voice from the water, a growing conviction that something in the bay was aware of him specifically. He had connected these experiences, however loosely, to an 1891 incident involving a man named Captain Doyle and 17 drowned sailors. He had disappeared without physical trace. Those were the facts. The footsteps in the lamp room were a separate matter. Elias was still working on where to file those. The woman behind the counter, the same one who had gone still when he mentioned the lighthouse the day before, refilled his coffee without being asked and lingered a half-second longer than necessary. Elias decided to use it. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "An older woman, local. Someone who might know the history of this area well. The deep history." The woman regarded him with the careful, measuring expression that small-town people reserve for outsiders who are asking the right questions for possibly the wrong reasons. "You'd want Vera Hatch," she said finally. "She's on Coxfield Road. Gray house, white shutters, the one with the ceramic pelicans on the porch. She doesn't have a phone that she answers, so you'll have to just go." She paused. "She'll know why you're there before you knock. She always does." Elias thanked her, left a larger tip than he could afford, and drove out to Coxfield Road. The gray house with the white shutters sat at the end of a gravel lane bordered by tall marsh grass that whispered and bent in the bay wind. There were indeed ceramic pelicans on the porch. 5 of them, arranged with what appeared to be deliberate asymmetry, as if they had been placed not for decoration but for some purpose Elias couldn't decode. Wood smoke rose from the chimney. A single light burned in the front window, warm and amber against the gray morning. He knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately, as if she had been standing just on the other side of it, waiting. Old Vera Hatch was perhaps 80 years old, perhaps older, the kind of age that stops being countable and becomes instead a quality, like the age of a river or a stone wall. She was small and upright, with white hair pulled back severely and eyes that were a remarkable pale gray-green, the exact color of the Chesapeake in November. She wore a dark cardigan over a house dress, and she held a ceramic mug in both hands with the practiced ease of someone for whom tea is less a preference than a philosophy. She looked at Elias for a long, unhurried moment. Then she looked at the oilcloth bundle under his arm. "You found Edmund's logbooks," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Elias said. "Come in then," she said. "I've been waiting for someone to find those for a good long while." Her front room was dense with the accumulated texture of a long and attentive life. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, framed maritime charts on the walls, a collection of tide tables going back decades, photographs of the bay in different seasons and different lights. It smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and something faintly briny, like the whole room was slowly, gently becoming part of the Chesapeake. She poured him tea without asking and sat across from him in a high-backed chair that clearly belonged to her the way a throne belongs to its occupant. "What do you know about Captain Doyle?" he asked. Vera wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the fire. Silas Doyle, she said, and even the way she said the name had weight to it, deliberate, careful, the way you say a word in a language where the wrong pronunciation can change the meaning entirely. He ran the bay in the years after the Civil War, smuggling mostly tobacco, untaxed spirits, contraband goods coming up from the Carolina coast. He was careful and he was clever, and for 20 years nobody could touch him. She paused. The fire shifted. Outside, the marsh grass whispered. In the winter of 1891, she continued, Doyle was moving a large shipment north. He had 17 men with him, crew, hired hands, men who needed work and didn't ask too many questions. Somewhere south of Harlow Point, something went wrong. There are different versions of what exactly. Some say a dispute over the split of the payment. Some say Doyle discovered one of the men was a federal informant. Some say he simply decided, in the cold mathematics of greed, that 17 fewer mouths meant 17 larger shares for himself. She let that settle. He scuttled the secondary vessel with the men aboard. 17 souls, drowned in the cold waters of the Chesapeake Bay, less than a mile from the Harlow Point Light. The lighthouse keeper at the time, Aldous Crane, saw it happen, or saw enough of it. He reported Doyle to the federal authorities. And Doyle was arrested? Elias said. Doyle was arrested, Vera confirmed. Tried, convicted, hanged in Baltimore in March of 1892. She looked up from the fire then, and her pale eyes held something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, but lived in the complicated territory between them. But before he hanged, he spoke a curse. A maritime curse, old and specific, the kind that has roots in things older than law or church. He named the lighthouse. He named the keeper's post. He said that every man who kept that light would hear the voices of the drowned until they could no longer tell the living from the dead. That the bay would call to them. That sooner or later, the bay would call them home. The fire crackled. Elias felt the warmth of it on his face, but not, somehow, in his bones. How many keepers? He asked quietly. Vera looked at him steadily. Between 1892 and 1954? 6 keepers. 3 resigned within their first season. Wouldn't say why, wouldn't talk about it, simply left. 1 had what the records call a nervous breakdown and was removed. 1 died of what was reported as a heart attack, alone in the cottage at the age of 34. She paused. And Edmund Harlow. Who disappeared? Who disappeared? She agreed. Edmund was a good man. Serious, decent. He wrote to me, actually, in the months before. We had corresponded. I was doing local historical research at the time, and he was helpful. His last letter came in August of 1954. She set down her mug. He said the voice had learned his name. He said he was beginning to understand that the curse wasn't just about haunting. It was about replacement. The drowned needed a keeper. Someone to stay with them down there in the dark water. Someone to keep the light going from the other side. The room was very quiet. On the mantelpiece, an old ship's clock ticked with slow mechanical patience. The 70th anniversary of his disappearance, Elias said. Vera's pale eyes sharpened. You know about that. He mentioned it. In the logbook. That something was being counted. She nodded slowly. Maritime curses work in tidal cycles. 70 years is the completion of a great cycle. the point at which the curse either breaks or renews itself with full force. If it renews, she stopped. What happens if it renews? Elias asked. Vera looked at him for a long moment, with the expression of someone deciding how much truth a person can usefully hold. It needs a new keeper, she said quietly. It has always needed a new keeper. That is what the Bay is waiting for. That is what Doyle built into the curse when he spoke it in that Baltimore jail cell. The lighthouse cannot be left without a keeper, not by the dead. And every 70 years, if the living have been foolish enough to send someone there. She stopped again. She looked at the oilcloth bundle on the table between them. There is a way to break it, she said finally. Edmund knew it. He wrote it down, I believe, somewhere in those books. You'll need to find it. And you'll need to be there when the tide turns on the 70th year. When is that? Elias asked, though some part of him already knew. Old Vera Hatch picked up her mug, looked into it, and said, with the calm of someone who has been carrying this information for a very long time and is only now able to set it down. Tomorrow night, at the turn of the tide. Elias drove back to the causeway in the heavy October afternoon, the logbooks on the seat beside him, old Vera's words settling into him the way cold water settles. Slowly, completely reaching every part. He had one day. He had 3 logbooks he had not yet fully read. He had a curse he did not fully understand. And when he pulled onto the causeway and looked up at the lighthouse, he saw that the lamp room window, dark for 70 years, sealed from the inside, was fogged with breath, as if something inside had been watching the road, waiting for him to come back. Speech balloon, he was barely back inside when his phone lit up with a text from his sister Maggie. Hey, I'm about 2 hours away. Thought I'd surprise you. Can't wait to see this lighthouse you're working at. It sounds so cool. Elias stared at the message for a long time. Then he looked up at the ceiling above him. Then he typed back, Maggie, don't come. He hit send. The message sat undelivered for 30 seconds. Then her reply came through. A smiling emoji and, too late, already on 50. See you soon. Elias spent the hour before Maggie arrived doing 2 things simultaneously. Finishing his second read of Edmund Harlow's logbooks, searching every margin and back page for any mention of how the curse could be broken, and composing in his head a version of recent events that would convince his sister to turn around and drive back to Baltimore without frightening her. He completed neither task successfully. The logbooks offered no clear answer, not yet. There were fragments, references, half-formed thoughts in Harlow's later entries that suggested he had been piecing something together in those final weeks, some method or ritual or act of reckoning. But the writing was too fragmented, too pressured to be fully coherent. It was like trying to read a map that someone had been drawing while running. The shape of the destination was almost there. Almost. And the version of events suitable for Maggie, the reassuring, rational, older brother version, collapsed entirely the moment her small blue hatchback appeared at the near end of the causeway, and she stepped out into the October wind with her scarf flying sideways and her face tilted up toward the lighthouse with an expression of pure, uncomplicated delight. She was 24 years old and had always been the kind of person who walked into rooms and immediately understood them, not intellectually, but in some deeper, more instinctive way, the way certain people can feel the mood of a place the moment they cross its threshold. Their mother had called it sensitivity. Their grandmother had called it the gift. Elias had spent most of his adult life calling it inconvenient, because it meant Maggie was almost impossible to deceive and almost impossible to protect. and those two things had always been in uncomfortable tension with each other. She crossed the causeway with her bag over her shoulder and her eyes already moving. Up the stone walls, across the black rocks below, along the line of the keeper's cottage, up to the lamp room, and Elias watched her face and saw the exact moment the delight shifted into something quieter. It lasted only a second. Then she was hugging him, laughing, talking about the traffic on Route 50 and the podcast she'd been listening to and how she'd brought a bag of Old Bay chips and 2 cans of soup because she assumed he was eating badly. She was warm and bright and completely, entirely herself, and Elias held on to the hug a half-second longer than usual and told himself firmly that she would be fine, that he would make sure she was fine. "This place is incredible," she said, stepping back and turning to look at the lighthouse again. "I mean, it's unsettling, obviously. It has that feeling. But incredible." "What feeling?" Elias said, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Maggie tilted her head slightly. "Like it's listening," she said simply, as if this were a perfectly ordinary observation about a building. Then she picked up her bag and walked inside. The afternoon passed in the deceptive normalcy that sometimes settles over frightening situations when a loved one is present, filling the silence with conversation and the particular comfort of shared company. Maggie heated the soup on the wood stove, and they sat at the old table and talked about their family, their mother's recent move to a smaller apartment in Frederick, the job Maggie was considering in Philadelphia, the general difficult comedy of being young and financially uncertain in the modern world. The logbooks were on the table between them, but Elias had turned them face down, and Maggie hadn't asked about them yet. Outside, the October afternoon went gray and then grayer, the light flattening and softening until the bay and the sky became the same muted color, distinguished only by the line of dark water between them. The wind picked up as evening came, pushing against the cottage windows with a low, insistent pressure, and the fire in the wood stove worked harder to keep the cold at bay. It was Maggie who broke the comfortable silence first. "Elias," she said quietly, "what is that sound?" He set down his mug. "What sound?" She was looking toward the interior doorway that led to the base of the lighthouse stairs. Her head was slightly tilted, her expression focused in the particular way it got when she was concentrating on something at the edge of perception. "It's like humming, very low, coming from upstairs." Elias listened. He could hear the wind, the fire, the distant, rhythmic percussion of the bay against the black rocks below. "I don't hear anything," he said. "You wouldn't," she said, without any particular judgment in it, just a statement of established fact. She looked at him then, and something in her expression shifted, became more careful, more watchful. "Tell me what's actually going on here," she said. "Not the preservation office version, the real version." So he told her, all of it, the 3 knocks that first night, the logbooks beneath the floorboards, old Vera's account of Captain Doyle and the 17 drowned sailors, the curse and its 70-year cycle, the offshore light, the footsteps in the lamp room. He told it plainly and in order, the way he had been trained to document things, and Maggie listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her soup mug, her eyes steady on his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Tomorrow night," she said, "the 70th anniversary." "Yes, and you don't know yet how to break it." "Not completely. I think it's in the logbooks. I think Harlow figured it out but didn't finish writing it down before." He stopped. "Before whatever happened to him happened." Maggie finished. She looked down at the logbooks. Then she reached out and turned them face up and opened the third one, the final one, with a steadiness that made Elias feel simultaneously proud of her and terrified for her. "Then we read," she said. "Both of us. Tonight." They read until nearly midnight. The wood stove was fed and fed again. The wind outside built itself into a low continuous moan, and the cottage held its small warmth around them while they worked through Harlow's fragmented final entries with the focused attention of people looking for a specific word in a language they are still learning. It was Maggie who found it. Not in the logbooks. On the last page of the oilcloth wrapping itself, inside, where it had been folded against the back cover of the third book, invisible unless you unfolded the cloth completely and held it to the light. Written in pencil, not ink, in letters so small and careful they might have been written by a man lying very flat and keeping his hands very still so as not to be heard. The names, all 17, spoken aloud into the storm. Not for the dead, for the living. So they are remembered. So the drowned are witnessed. That is what Doyle stole from them. Not their lives, but their names. Give the names back to the water, and the water gives back what it took. The names are in the county records. Annapolis. I know them. God forgive me for not speaking them sooner. Below that, in a column so small Maggie had to hold the lantern directly over it, were 17 names. 17 names written in the last hours of Edmund Harlow's hand, preserved for 70 years in oilcloth and shadow, waiting for exactly this moment and exactly these two people. Elias and Maggie looked at each other across the table in the firelight. "He knew," Maggie said softly. "He figured it out. He just ran out of time." "We have until tomorrow night," Elias said. "The turn of the tide." Maggie nodded slowly. Then she looked toward the window, the one facing the bay, and her expression changed. Just slightly. Just enough. "Elias," she said carefully, "there are wet footprints on the floor." He looked. There were. Leading from the interior door across the stone floor toward the cottage's waterside window. Bare feet, perfectly formed, damp and dark against the pale stone. They had not been there an hour ago. He was certain of that. They led to the window and stopped, as if whoever had made them had stood there for some time, looking out at the water, and then simply ceased to exist. They were small footprints, the size of a child's, or a very small man's. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I'm going to sleep," Maggie said finally, with the particular quiet resolve of someone who has decided that fear is not a useful tool right now. "You should too. We need to be sharp tomorrow." Elias looked at the footprints, then at the window, then at his sister. "Maggie." He chose his words carefully. "If you wake up in the night, if you feel like going outside or going to the water, wake me first. Promise me." She met his eyes. Something passed between them, the specific, wordless communication of siblings who have known each other long enough to speak in the spaces between words. "I promise," she said. She did not mean to break it. That was the thing that Elias would turn over in his mind for years afterward, that Maggie had meant every word of that promise with her whole awake self. What happened at 3 in the morning was not a choice. It was not Maggie. He woke to silence. The specific silence of a room from which a presence has recently departed. He turned and saw her cot empty, the blanket folded back with an eerie neatness that bore no resemblance to the way his sister normally left a bed. He was across the room and out the cottage door in seconds. The night was cold and absolutely clear, the October sky salted with stars, the bay lying flat and black and mirror still below the rocks. The wind had died completely. The world was so quiet that his own footsteps on the causeway planks sounded enormous. Maggie was standing at the water's edge, at the base of the black rocks, where the Chesapeake lapped with slow, dark patience. She stood in her socked feet and her sleep clothes, arms slightly out from her sides, face tilted down toward the water. Her eyes were open but unfocused, the flat, interior gaze of the deeply asleep, and she was making no sound at all. "Maggie," he said quietly. Then, louder, "Maggie." She didn't move, didn't blink. The water lapped at the rocks 6 inches from her feet. He crossed to her in 4 quick strides and put his hands on her shoulders and turned her firmly away from the water. She swayed. Her eyes moved, slowly, like something surfacing from a great depth, and found his face, and for just a moment, in the half-second before she was fully awake, he saw in her expression something that was not Maggie at all. Something older. Something that looked at him from behind her eyes with a patience that had nothing to do with the living. Then she blinked, and she was Maggie again. Frightened, disoriented, shivering. I was. She looked around, at the water, at her wet socks, back at Elias. I was dreaming about the names, she whispered. Someone was reading them to me. A man's voice. He was counting them. He only got to 9. Elias wrapped his jacket around her and held her by the shoulders and looked out at the bay. The offshore light was there, closer than it had ever been. Blue pale and perfectly still, perhaps 100 yards from the rocks, burning silently beneath the surface of the flat black water. And for just a moment, one terrible, clarifying moment, he could see by its light the shape of something vast moving slowly beneath it. Not a fish, not a boat, something with edges that didn't resolve into any form he had language for. Something that knew they were standing there. Something that had been counting. He got Maggie inside. He locked the door. He put more wood on the fire until the cottage was almost too warm, and he sat at the table with Harlow's final note and the 17 names, and he read them over and over until the sky outside began to lighten, saying each name quietly to himself like a rehearsal. Tomorrow night the tide would turn. Tomorrow night he would have to stand at the edge of that water, with that light, with whatever moved beneath it, and give 17 names back to the Chesapeake Bay. Tonight, the only thing standing between his sister and the dark water had been 20 feet and a light sleep. He did not sleep again. The lighthouse above him was quiet now. No footsteps, no knocking, just the soft, patient silence of a building that knows something is coming and has decided, for the moment, to wait. In the lamp room, far above, the old lens caught the first gray light of dawn and held it. And for just a second, if you had been standing on the causeway looking up, you might have thought you saw the ghost of a glow deep in the glass. Not light exactly, more like the memory of light, more like something getting ready. Speech balloon one day remained. The tide would turn at 11:47 the following night. And somewhere beneath the flat black waters of the Chesapeake Bay, something ancient and patient and deeply, terribly awake was rising toward the surface, because it had been counting, and it had finally, after 70 years, reached 17. The morning of the last day arrived without ceremony. No dramatic sky, no howling wind, no sign from the natural world that this particular Wednesday in late October was anything other than what it appeared. A cool, gray, ordinary Chesapeake morning, the kind that smells of low tide and wet leaves and the particular mineral coldness of water that has been sitting in the same place for a very long time. Gulls worked the shallows beyond the black rocks. A crab boat moved across the middle distance, unhurried and businesslike. The bay was the color of pewter, flat and wide and entirely indifferent to the small human drama taking place on the rock at its edge. Elias had watched the dawn come from the cottage window, the 17 names written on a sheet of paper in front of him, a mug of coffee grown cold at his elbow. He had not slept. He did not feel the absence of sleep in the way he normally would, as fog or irritability or a heaviness behind the eyes. He felt instead a strange, crystalline alertness, the kind that arrives when the body understands that something significant is approaching and decides that rest is a luxury that can be deferred. Maggie woke at 7 and came to sit across from him without speaking. She looked at the paper with the 17 names. She looked at him. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the wood stove and wrapped both hands around the mug and sat with him in the quiet for a long time. The way people sit together when words have temporarily exhausted their usefulness. Outside the window, the lighthouse rose above them both. Patient, enormous, saying nothing. "Tell me what you're going to do tonight," Maggie said finally. "Exactly. Walk me through it." "Old Vera said the names have to be spoken into the storm," Elias said. "At the water's edge, at the turn of the tide." 11:47, Maggie said. 11:47. "And if there's no storm?" Elias looked out at the gray sky. Vera seemed confident there would be. He paused. She seemed confident about most things. Maggie looked at the paper again. Read the names silently, her lips barely moving. 17 names from 1891. Working men's names, plain and solid and entirely real. Thomas Wicks, Samuel Cord, John Ferris, Robert Ames, William Pruitt. Men who had needed work and hadn't asked too many questions and had paid for that in the cold dark water of the Chesapeake Bay, while the lighthouse burned above them, and nobody on shore knew yet what Silas Doyle had done. "They deserve to be remembered," Maggie said quietly. "Yes," Elias said. "That's the point. That's what Harlow understood. Doyle didn't just kill them. He made sure they were forgotten. No trial, no names in the record, no family notified. Just 17 men gone into the water as if they had never existed. The curse isn't just about haunting. It's about erasure. And what breaks it is the opposite of erasure." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "Witnessing," she said. "Witnessing," he agreed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his briefly. Then she straightened, picked up her coffee, and said with the brisk, determined practicality that had always been her particular form of courage, "All right, then we have a full day before 11:47. Show me the logbooks. I want to read everything Harlow wrote. All of it." They read together through the morning, taking turns with the logbooks, passing them back and forth across the table, occasionally reading passages aloud to each other when something struck them as particularly important or particularly sad. Edmund Harlow emerged from the pages as a fully formed person. Not a ghost story, not a cautionary figure, but a man. A man who had loved this bay, who had found genuine peace in the solitude of the keeper's life, who had written about a family of osprey with the same careful attention he gave to shipping logs and weather patterns. A man who had been, simply and terribly, in the wrong place when a 70-year curse came looking for its next keeper. At one point, Maggie set down the second logbook and looked out the window toward the water for a long time. "He wasn't afraid of the lighthouse," she said. "Not at the beginning. He loved it here." "I know," Elias said. "That makes it sadder." "I know," he said again. The afternoon brought clouds, real ones this time, building on the southwestern horizon with the slow, organized purpose of weather that has somewhere specific to be. By 3 o'clock the sky over the bay had darkened 2 full shades. and the water below had shifted from pewter to something deeper, more opaque, the color of old iron. The gulls disappeared. The crab boat that had been working the middle distance turned for harbor. The bay, which had been merely quiet all morning, became something different, became still in the particular way that living things go still when they sense a change approaching. Maggie noticed it first. She had been standing at the waterside window for several minutes, her arms crossed, watching the horizon. "It's coming," she said simply. Elias came to stand beside her. The southwestern sky was a wall of dark cloud now, moving with a deliberateness that seemed almost intentional. Not the scattered, wandering movement of ordinary weather, but something more directed, more purposeful. Lightning flickered in its depths, too far away yet for thunder. The water below the rocks had begun to move differently, a deep underlying swell that had nothing to do with wind. "How much time?" Maggie asked. Elias checked his watch. 7 hours and 40 minutes. She nodded. They stood together and watched the storm come. It was at 2 in the morning, or what Elias would have said was 2 in the morning, though his watch had stopped at some point in the evening and refused to restart, that he first climbed to the lamp room. He had been putting it off. He recognized this honestly. The sealed lamp room at the top of the lighthouse had been the source of the knocking on the first night, the footsteps on the second, and he had found reasons to work around it, to document the lower levels, to focus his attention on the cottage and the causeway and the logbooks and Maggie. But the storm was building outside. Maggie was resting on her cot with strict instructions to stay inside, and something in the quality of the evening, a pressure almost physical that had been building since sunset, told him that the lamp room was where he needed to be. He unlocked the iron door at the base of the stairs with the heavy key from Pruitt and began to climb. The lighthouse stairs were iron and spiral, bolted to the central column, and they rang softly under his boots in a way that sounded, in the enclosed stone column, almost like a voice, a low metallic resonance that followed each footstep a half-second later, like an echo that couldn't quite keep up. He counted the steps without meaning to. 47, 48, 49. The air grew colder as he rose. Not the cold of height or exposure, but the cold of enclosed spaces that have held the same air for a very long time. Cold that had opinions. The lamp room door at the top was unlocked. He was certain it had been locked. The preservation office records had listed it as sealed from the inside, requiring specialist equipment to open without damage. He stood in front of it for a long moment with his hand on the iron latch, and then he opened it and stepped through. The lamp room was circular, perhaps 12 feet across, enclosed by a continuous band of salt-hazed glass that looked out in every direction over the Chesapeake Bay. The old Fresnel lens stood at the center, enormous, intricate, a cathedral of precisely ground glass prisms arranged in a beehive of concentric rings that had once gathered and focused the lighthouse beam into a single powerful shaft visible 20 miles at sea. It had not turned in 70 years. It stood in the center of the room like a monument to its own silence. Elias moved to the glass and looked out. The storm was close now. The southwestern sky was entirely dark, the lightning continuous and close enough that the thunder followed within seconds, rolling across the water in long, resonant waves. The bay below was no longer still. It moved in heavy, purposeful swells, the black water catching the lightning and throwing it back in broken fragments. And there, perhaps 100 yards offshore, bearing almost exactly northeast, the light. He had seen it from below twice. From up here, through the old glass of the lamp room, it was different, larger, more defined. It burned with a cold, steady blue-white radiance, moving neither with nor against the growing swells, but simply maintaining its position with a fixity that had nothing natural about it. It was the light of something that did not move because it did not need to, because it had already arrived at exactly where it intended to be. Elias raised the binoculars he had brought from the cottage and found the light in the lenses. Below the light, suspended in the dark water, motionless, perhaps 15 or 20 feet beneath the surface, was a face. He held the binoculars steady through 3 full seconds of thundering heartbeat before he was certain of what he was seeing. It was not a trick of refraction or light or the particular way water distorts the shapes beneath it. It was a face, a man's face, broad and weathered and utterly still, with open eyes that held no color, eyes that were the same pale, sourceless blue as the light above them. The face was looking up, directly at the lamp room, directly at Elias. He lowered the binoculars, raised them again. The face was still there, still looking, patient with the specific, terrible patience of something that has been waiting for 70 years and has therefore developed a relationship with waiting that goes beyond mere endurance into something almost philosophical. Then the light moved, not toward him, sideways, slowly, tracing a long arc through the dark water. And as it moved, other shapes became visible in its glow, suspended in the water around the central light like the points of a compass, evenly spaced, motionless. Elias counted them with shaking hands and shaking breath, and the binoculars pressed hard against his eyes. 17. 17 shapes, arranged in a circle beneath the water, their pale faces all tilted upward, all looking at the lighthouse with the same patient, colorless gaze. 17 men drowned in 1891 and uncounted ever since, held in the cold dark of the Chesapeake Bay by a curse built from greed and silenced names and 70 years of unanswered waiting. The storm broke above the lighthouse at that exact moment. Not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, as if a door had been opened. Rain hammered the glass of the lamp room from every direction simultaneously. The thunder became continuous, and the lightning illuminated the bay in strobing blue-white flashes that made the scene below look like images from a very old film. Flickering, incomplete, more terrible for the gaps between the frames. And in one of those lightning flashes, one specific, prolonged burst that lasted perhaps 2 full seconds and lit the entire bay like noon, Elias saw something else. Between the circle of 17 and the lighthouse rocks, standing upright in perhaps 4 feet of water, not floating but standing, was the figure of a man in a keeper's coat and a keeper's cap, his back to the lighthouse, facing the circle of the drowned. His arms were slightly raised. His head was bowed. He stood in the storm-churned water with the stillness of someone who has performed the same vigil for so long that the body no longer registers it as effort. Edmund Harlow, still keeping watch, still on duty, after 70 years, still standing between the drowned men and the shore, unable to rest, unable to leave, tethered to a post he could not abandon and a light he could no longer tend. The lightning faded. The bay went dark. When the next flash came, the figure was gone. Elias stood in the lamp room with the storm beating against the glass from every side, and he felt something shift inside him. Not fear, though fear was certainly present, alive and insistent in his chest. Something underneath the fear. Something that felt, despite everything, remarkably like resolve. Edmund Harlow had figured out how to end it, had written it down in pencil on the inside of a piece of oilcloth, hidden it where someone, someday, would find it, had stood watch over 17 drowned men for 7 decades, waiting for the cycle to complete, waiting for someone with the names to come and speak them. Someone had come. The tide would turn at 11:47. Elias turned from the glass, descended the iron stairs with steady boots, and went to wake his sister. Below the lighthouse, in the black and churning Chesapeake, The circle of 17 held their positions in the cold dark, patient as stone, their pale faces tilted upward through the fathoms toward the light they had watched for 70 years. And at the center of the circle, the blue-white light burned steadier now, brighter, as if something at the very bottom of the bay had opened its eyes and was finally, fully, irrevocably awake. The storm had come. The tide was moving. The count was almost complete. Elias had 4 hours. Speech balloon, he didn't know yet what it would cost him to stand at the edge of that water in the teeth of the storm and speak 17 names into the face of a drowned captain's curse. He didn't know what Captain Doyle, not a ghost, not a memory, but a force, a will, a rage that had outlasted its own body by a century and 30 years, would do to stop him. He was about to find out. Maggie was not asleep when Elias came back down. She was sitting upright on her cot with her knees drawn to her chest and the paper bearing the 17 names held in both hands, reading them in the low amber light of the wood stove as if committing them to memory, which Elias realized was exactly what she was doing. She looked up when he came through the door, read his face the way she had always been able to read his face, and said nothing for a moment. Just looked at him steadily, the paper in her hands, the storm hammering the cottage roof above them both. "You saw them," she said. "Yes, all 17. And Harlow." He sat down across from her and pressed both hands flat on the table and told her everything he had seen from the lamp room. The circle of faces beneath the water, the blue-white light, the figure of Edmund Harlow standing between the drowned and the shore in his keeper's coat, maintaining a vigil that had outlasted his own life by 7 decades. He told it plainly and completely, the way he had always told Maggie difficult things, without softening because she had never needed softening, and without embellishment because the truth was already more than enough. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she looked down at the names in her hands. "He's been protecting them," she said softly. "Harlow, all this time, standing between them and whatever Doyle's curse would do to them if they were left unguarded." Elias hadn't thought of it exactly that way, but the moment she said it, he felt it settle into place with the particular click of a true thing finding its position. "Yes," he said, "I think that's exactly right. That's why he couldn't leave," Maggie said. "Not because the curse trapped him, because he chose to stay." She looked up, and her eyes were bright in the firelight with something that was not quite tears and not quite anger but carried elements of both. "He was a keeper. That's what keepers do." The storm surged outside. A long, deep roll of thunder that moved through the stone walls of the cottage like a wave moving through water, felt as much as heard. The wood stove fire shuddered in its grate. The lamp above the table swung slightly on its hook, casting moving shadows across the walls. And for just a moment the shadows arranged themselves into shapes that Elias chose firmly not to interpret. He checked his watch. Still stopped. He looked at Maggie's phone. 2 hours and 19 minutes to 11:47. "We should go up," he said, "to the lamp room, before the tide turns. I think we need to be up there first. I think that's where he'll come." Maggie uncurled from the cot and stood and pulled on her heavy coat without hesitation. She folded the paper with the 17 names and put it in her inside pocket, close to her chest. Then she picked up the lantern from the table and looked at her brother with an expression that he recognized from their childhood, from the time she had been 11 years old and had walked with him through the old Hagerstown cemetery on a dare and had not flinched once, not a single time, though he had flinched plenty. The expression that said, "I am frightened. I am also not going anywhere." "Let's go," she said. The iron stairs rang under their boots, that same low metallic resonance, but louder now with 2 of them climbing. the sound filling the stone column and rising ahead of them into the darkness above. The storm made the lighthouse itself seem alive, not menacingly, but in the way that very old structures respond to weather, a deep structural conversation between stone and wind and rain that manifested as vibration, as subtle shifts of air, as the occasional low moan from the iron fixtures in the walls. The lighthouse was speaking in its own language, and Elias found he no longer needed to translate. The lamp room was exactly as he had left it. The great Fresnel lens stood at the center, dark and silent. The storm hammered the glass from all sides. The bay below was invisible in the rain except when lightning came, and then it appeared in those strobing flashes as a vast, heaving, silver-black expanse alive with whitecaps that hadn't existed 2 hours ago. They stood together at the glass and looked out. The offshore light was still there, if anything brighter. The storm water above it churned and opaque, but the light burning through it with the specific insistence of something that cannot be extinguished by mere weather. The circle of 17 was not visible from here in the storm, but Elias knew they were there. He could feel it in the way you feel the presence of something large and silent in a dark room, not seeing it but aware of the shape it makes in the air around it. Maggie put her hand on his arm. "Elias," she said quietly, "look at the lens." He turned. The Fresnel lens, dark for 70 years, its mechanism seized, its clockwork gears rusted permanently into stillness, was moving. Not dramatically, not with any great mechanical noise or obvious rotation, but moving slowly with the hesitant, effortful quality of something waking from a very long sleep. The prisms caught the lightning from outside and fractured it, threw it across the walls of the lamp room in broken, brilliant fragments, blues and whites and the cold silver of deep water, and as it moved the fragments moved with it, sweeping the curved walls in slow arcs, and the lamp room filled with a light that was not quite natural and not quite supernatural but existed in the threshold space between those two things. And in the center of that light, standing beside the lens, one hand resting on its brass housing with the casual familiarity of a man who has touched that same surface 10,000 times, was Edmund Harlow. He was not what Elias had expected, not transparent, not dramatic, not the theatrical specter of horror stories. He was simply present, a man of perhaps 50, solid seeming in his keeper's coat and cap, with a broad, weathered face and dark eyes that held an expression of such profound and patient exhaustion that Elias felt it in his own bones. He was wet. His coat was dark with water, his boots leaving damp marks on the lamp room floor with each slight shift of his weight. He smelled of the bay, that deep, mineral, ancient smell of water that has been in the same place since before memory. He looked at Elias first, then at Maggie, then at the paper she had taken from her inside pocket and was holding in her hands. Something in his face changed, not dramatically. A small shift, a slight loosening of the exhaustion around his eyes, the way a man's face changes when he sees something he has been waiting for so long that he had almost stopped believing it would come. "You found them," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with the flat vowels of a mid-century Maryland working man, entirely real and entirely ordinary. "The names. We found them," Elias said. His own voice was steadier than he expected. "You hid them well." "I hid them where someone like you would look," Harlow said. "Under the floor, in the structure. I knew whoever came next would be someone who looked at buildings the way I do. The way I did. A slight correction acknowledging what he was. Someone who understood that old buildings keep things." "How long?" Maggie asked. Her voice was very quiet. "How long have you been here?" Harlow looked at her with those dark, exhausted eyes. "Long enough to lose count. he said. Long enough to stop minding, mostly. The bay it is what it is. It keeps you company in its way. A pause. The men keep me company. The 17, Elias said. They can't leave either, Harlow said. That's Doyle's work. He didn't just drown them, he anchored them. Tied their souls to the place of their deaths the way you'd tie a boat to a post. They can't move on. Can't rest. Can't be anything but what they are. 17 men in cold water, held in place by a dead man's spite. His voice, which had been so steady, shifted slightly on that last phrase. Something older and rawer moving beneath the surface of it, like the current beneath flat water. I stayed because someone had to, because they needed a keeper, because that is what I am. Edmund, Maggie said, and the use of his given name made him look at her with a directness that was almost startling. We know how to break it. The names, he said, the names, spoken into the storm, at the turn of the tide. He nodded slowly. I worked it out in those last weeks. I should have done it sooner. I knew what needed to be done, and I kept thinking I had more time. The exhaustion in his face deepened for a moment, carrying the specific weight of a regret that has been lived with for 70 years and has therefore become as familiar and permanent as furniture. I ran out of time. You didn't run out of time, Elias said. You hid the names. You stayed with them. You kept watch for 70 years until someone came who could finish it. He paused. You didn't run out of time, Edmund. You used every second of it. Harlow looked at him. The lamp room was filled with the slow, fractured light of the turning lens, the storm outside a continuous percussion against the glass, and in that light Edmund Harlow's face held an expression that Elias would spend the rest of his life being unable to fully describe. Something between relief and grief and gratitude, and the particular complicated emotion of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and can finally, with permission, set it down. Doyle will fight it, Harlow said. He's been in that water longer than I've been in this lighthouse. He's not a ghost. He's a will, a persistence. He'll know what you're doing the moment you start, and he'll use everything he has to stop you. He looked at Maggie specifically. He'll use her. She's open to him in a way you're not. He knows that. He's been working on her since she arrived. The sleepwalking, Maggie said. He'll try again. Harder. At the water's edge, when you're reading the names, he'll try to take her under. Harlow's voice was flat and factual, the voice of someone reporting weather conditions. You cannot let go of her hand. Whatever happens, whatever you see or hear or think you understand, do not let go of her hand. I won't, Elias said. Harlow nodded. He looked at the lens, still turning, its slow rotation filling the room with cold, broken light. He put his hand on it again, that same gesture, casual and intimate, the gesture of a man and his work. When you speak the last name, he said, the light will go. The real light, not this. He indicated the fractured lamp room glow. The light offshore. When that goes, it's done. The anchor breaks. They can move on. He paused. I can move on. And Doyle? Elias asked. Something crossed Harlow's face. Not quite a smile, but its older, more complicated relative. Doyle spent 130 years holding 17 men in cold water out of spite, he said. When the anchor breaks, he goes with it, into whatever comes after spite. He looked at Elias steadily. I wouldn't want to be Silas Doyle at that moment, but then, I never would have. The storm surged. The lighthouse shuddered. A deep, structural tremor, not violent but enormous, like a giant turning in its sleep. The lens stuttered in its rotation and then steadied. And in that moment of stuttering, the light in the lamp room changed. The cold fractured blue-white of the Fresnel prisms briefly overtaken by something warmer, something that was almost the amber of the old oil-burning lamps, the light the lighthouse had thrown across the Chesapeake Bay for 80 years before Edmund Harlow took his post. The light of a lighthouse doing what a lighthouse was built to do. Warning, guiding, keeping the lost from the rocks. Harlow looked at them both one final time. His dark eyes moved from Maggie to Elias and back again with the unhurried thoroughness of a man making sure he has forgotten nothing, left nothing unsaid. 40 minutes, he said. The tide turns in 40 minutes. Go to the water's edge. Hold her hand. Speak every name, all 17 in order the way I wrote them. Don't stop, no matter what happens. Don't stop until the last name is spoken. We won't stop, Maggie said. I know, Harlow said. And the way he said it, the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of it, made Elias understand that Harlow had seen something in them, both of them, that justified 70 years of waiting. That whatever had brought Elias Croft to a Maryland lighthouse on the 70th anniversary of Edmund Harlow's disappearance was not accident, not coincidence, not the random carelessness of the universe, but something older and more purposeful than any of those things. Something, perhaps, that had also been keeping watch. The lamp room door opened of its own accord behind them. The iron stairs waited below, ringing softly in the storm's vibration, leading down toward the causeway and the black rocks and the churning Chesapeake Bay. Elias looked at the place where Edmund Harlow had been standing. He was already gone. The lens continued its slow rotation, throwing fractured light across the empty room, illuminating nothing but the storm-hazed glass and the dark water beyond and the pale blue glow of 17 souls waiting, as they had waited for 130 years, for someone to say their names. They went down the stairs together, Elias first, Maggie's hand on his shoulder. The cottage door opened into the full force of the storm, rain horizontal and cold, the bay wind a physical thing that pushed against them with intent, the thunder so continuous now it had become a kind of weather in itself, a rolling, permanent condition of the night. The causeway planks were slick under their feet. The black rocks below were invisible in the dark and the rain, located only by the sound of water breaking against them. Elias reached back and took Maggie's hand. She held on. They walked toward the water. Speech balloon 40 minutes. 17 names. One dead captain who had held a grudge for 130 years and had no intention of releasing it quietly. The storm was at its peak. The tide was almost at its turn. And somewhere in the black water below the rocks, 17 faces tilted upward toward the surface, waiting, as they had always waited, to finally hear someone say, "We know who you were. We know your names. We remember you." The storm had become something beyond weather. Elias understood this the moment they stepped off the causeway and onto the black rocks at the lighthouse base. Understood it not intellectually but physically, in the way the wind moved against them. It was not the random, multidirectional push of ordinary storm wind. It had a direction, a specific, deliberate, insistent direction, pushing them back, away from the water's edge, back toward the causeway and the cottage and the mainland, as if the air itself had been recruited to a purpose, as if something did not want them at the water. He leaned into it and pulled Maggie forward by their joined hands, and she came without resistance, head down, her free hand holding her coat closed at the throat. The rain was cold and horizontal and hit exposed skin like small thrown stones. The black rocks beneath their feet were slick with spray and rain, irregular and treacherous in the dark, and Elias picked each step with deliberate care, feeling for purchase, testing each surface before committing his weight. Beside him, Maggie moved with the same careful discipline, her hand in his a constant warm pressure that he was using, he realized, as much for his own steadiness as for her protection. The water's edge was 6 feet below the top of the black rocks. A short descent down a natural step in the stone to a narrow ledge where the Chesapeake lapped and surged with each swell. Elias helped Maggie down and they stood together on the ledge in the full force of the storm, the bay directly in front of them, heaving and black and enormous, the rain driving across its surface in sheets that the lightning illuminated in strobing silver. The offshore light was still there, closer than it had ever been, perhaps 50 yards from the rocks now, burning with a cold intensity that had nothing to do with the storm above it. Steady where everything else moved, fixed where everything else churned. And around it, just visible in its blue-white radiance, the circle of 17. Their pale faces upturned, their stillness absolute. Elias looked at his phone. The screen was cracked and water-damaged from the rain, but the display still functioned. 11:41. 6 minutes. He looked at Maggie. She already had the paper in her hand, the 17 names, though how she was keeping it readable in the driving rain he couldn't entirely explain, except that some things, perhaps, are more durable than paper when the moment requires it. She looked at him and shouted over the storm. "Together. You read, I read with you. Both our voices." He nodded, looked back at the water, at the light, at the circle. At 11:43, the storm did something new. The wind, which had been pushing them back toward the lighthouse, stopped, not died down, not lessened, stopped, a complete and instantaneous cessation, as if a switch had been thrown, leaving behind a silence so sudden and total that Elias's ears rang with it. The rain continued, straight down now in the windless air, heavy and cold, but the roaring, pushing, recruited wind was simply gone, and in its absence the storm felt different, felt watchful, as if it had been making noise to cover something that now no longer needed covering. The water directly in front of them changed. The heavy swells that had been breaking against the rocks flattened. Not gradually, not naturally, but all at once, the way a surface flattens when something very large rises beneath it, displacing the movement from below. The rain fell on water that had become almost perfectly still, and the offshore light, in that stillness, seemed to burn brighter, spreading its blue-white radiance across a wider area of the flat black surface. And from beneath the water, not from any specific direction, not from the offshore light or the circle of 17 or any identifiable point, but from everywhere beneath the surface simultaneously, came a sound. Not the voice from Harlow's logbooks, not the almost singing peripheral thing that he had written about in those careful, increasingly frightened entries. This was something else entirely, lower, older, the sound of a will that has been concentrated by 130 years of obsessive, furious, posthumous purpose into something that transcends what voices are normally capable of. It moved through the stone ledge under their feet and up through their bones and into their chests, and it didn't carry words, not exactly, but it carried meaning the way certain sounds carry meaning without language, the way a struck bell carries its note into the body of whoever stands near it. The meaning was, no, simple, total, immovable. No, you will not speak the names. You will not complete the count. You will not end what I built, what I paid for, what is mine. Maggie's hand tightened on his with sudden violence. He turned. Her face was wrong, not as dramatically as the night before, when he had found her at the water's edge with the flat, interior gaze of the sleepwalking. This was different, more subtle, more frightening precisely because of its subtlety. Her eyes were open and aware, but there was something behind them that was working against her, visible in the slight forward lean of her body toward the water, in the way her feet had shifted on the ledge, one toe at the very edge, in the way her free hand, the one not holding his, was hanging at her side with the fingers slightly spread, as if reaching for something just below the surface. "Maggie," he said sharply. Her eyes found his, the real Maggie, his sister, the girl who had walked through the Hagerstown cemetery without flinching, looked back at him from behind whatever was pressing against her from inside, and what he saw in her face was not fear but effort. She was fighting it. She had been fighting it since the moment the sound came up through the stone, and she was still fighting it, and she was winning, but the margin was narrow and getting narrower. "Read," she said through her teeth. "Elias, read the names. Now." He looked at the phone. 11:46. 1 minute. He looked at the water, the flat black surface, the blue-white light, the 17 faces tilted upward through the fathoms. And there, just visible at the edge of the light's reach, deeper than the 17 darker, a shape that was not a man and not quite anything else, a concentration of shadow and rage and 130 years of posthumous fury. Something looked back at him from the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. Captain Silas Doyle. Not a ghost, not a specter, a will, exactly as Harlow had described. A purpose so relentlessly maintained that it had survived the death of its body and the passage of a century and 30 years and was still here, still holding, still anchoring 17 souls to the place of their deaths out of the pure, inexhaustible spite of a man who had never in his living life understood that some things cannot be owned. 11:47. The tide turned. Elias felt it. A subtle shift in the movement of the water against the rocks. A change in the rhythm of the rain falling on the flat surface. Something deep and physical and ancient completing one motion and beginning another. The great tidal engine of the Chesapeake Bay, driven by forces that made human concerns look very small and very brief, reached the precise moment of its turning. "Thomas Wicks," Elias said, his voice loud and clear and aimed directly at the water, at the light, at the circle, at the shape in the dark below. "Thomas Wicks. Thomas Wicks," Maggie said beside him, her voice tight with effort but steady. The offshore light pulsed. One of the 17 faces, the nearest one, moved. Just slightly, just enough. "Samuel Cord," Elias said. "Samuel Cord. Samuel Cord," Maggie said. The pressure against Maggie's hand doubled. He felt it, the pull toward the water working through her body and into their joined hands, trying to drag her forward and him with her, or failing that to break their grip and take her alone. He locked his fingers around hers and planted his feet on the wet rock and leaned back against it with everything he had. John Ferris, Robert Ames, William Pruitt, each name like a stone thrown into still water, spreading out, finding something, making a mark. The offshore light flickered with each one. The circle of 17 moved with a subtle, growing restlessness. Not the stillness of the held and anchored, but the first tentative movements of things beginning, slowly, to come loose from what had been holding them. Henry Glass, Cornelius Wade, James Morrow. The sound from beneath the water returned, louder, less controlled. The ano of it cracked now with something that might have been desperation in a living thing. The flat surface of the bay shuddered. The rain fell harder. Lightning came so fast it was nearly continuous, and in its strobing light Elias could see the shape at the bottom of the bay moving, rising, no longer content to push from a distance, understanding now that distance was no longer enough. Maggie made a sound. Not a scream, not quite, but something that cost her, and her body jerked hard toward the water, and for one terrible half-second the ledge under Elias's feet gave him nothing, and he felt the physics of it tipping against him, felt the cold water reaching up from below. He did not let go. He pulled. Every muscle in his back and shoulders and legs went into it, his feet finding a crack in the rock and wedging into it, his whole body becoming a counterweight, and he pulled his sister back from the edge with a force that sent them both staggering backward against the rock face behind the ledge. She gasped. He said her name. She looked at him. Still fighting, still there, still Maggie. "Keep going," she said. "Don't stop." "Arthur Baines," he said, his voice raw. "George Fell, Peter Mace, Owen Clark." 11 names spoken. 6 remaining. The shape at the bottom of the bay was close enough now that he could see it clearly in the lightning, not rising to the surface but rising toward it, a mass of dark water and darker intent, moving with the terrible purpose of something that has decided that subtlety has run its course. The circle of 17 was fragmenting, the outer ones already moving, drifting upward, their anchors loosening with each name, but the inner ones still held, and the shape below was moving toward them, toward what remained of its construction, trying to shore up what was breaking apart. "Daniel Cross," Elias said. "Daniel Cross. Daniel Cross," Maggie said, her voice stronger now, something in the tide of it changing, the pressure lessening fractionally, as if the balance were shifting. "Marcus Bright. Tobias Hale. 2 left." The shape stopped rising, and in that cessation, that sudden stillness, Elias felt something he had not expected to feel at the bottom of a storm on a black rock in the Chesapeake Bay. He felt pity. Not for Doyle, not for the rage and the greed and the 130 years of posthumous spite, but for the smallness of it, for the terrible, wasted smallness of a man who had sacrificed 17 lives and his own soul for treasure and had ended up with nothing but a cold, dark anchor at the bottom of a bay, holding the dead in place because it was the only power he had left, and he could not imagine releasing even that. Some people, Elias thought with a clarity that the moment seemed to require, mistake holding on for strength. "Isaac Fell," he said, the penultimate name. His voice was entirely steady. "Isaac Fell," Maggie said. 1 name remaining. The shape below had stopped moving entirely. The circle of 17 was almost fully dispersed, their faces no longer tilted upward in waiting but turning, slowly, one by one, in the direction of somewhere else. Somewhere the water did not reach and the dark did not hold, and the count had long since been completed. Elias looked at Maggie. She looked at him. Her face was wet with rain and her eyes were clear and entirely her own, and she gave him the smallest, steadiest nod. They spoke the last name together. "William Dodd. William Dodd." The offshore light went out. Not dimmed. Not faded. Instantaneous and total, as if it had never been there, as if the Chesapeake Bay had simply forgotten it. The water where it had burned was just water, dark and ordinary and moving with the natural rhythm of the turned tide. The circle of 17 was gone. The shape at the bottom was gone. The sound from beneath the water was gone. The storm did not stop, but it changed, became in an instant simply weather again. Rain falling because clouds had gathered. Wind moving because pressure systems had shifted. The ordinary, impersonal, non-recruited mechanics of a Chesapeake October storm, with no agenda and no purpose and nothing directed at anyone standing on a black rock at the water's edge. Elias and Maggie stood on the ledge in the rain and breathed. After a long moment, Maggie looked up at the lighthouse above them. The lamp room was dark. The Fresnel lens had stopped turning. The lighthouse was what it had always been. Stone and iron and glass, 130 years old, empty, silent, at peace. And then, very slowly, like a long breath being released after a very long holding. The old lamp at the center of the Fresnel lens began to glow. Not bright, not the powerful 20-mile beam it had once thrown across the Chesapeake. Just a gentle, warm amber light, steady and quiet, filling the lamp room with the color of something that had been dark for a very long time and was finally, simply lit. Maggie made a sound beside him, half laugh, half something else entirely, and pressed her face against his shoulder for a moment. Above them, at the top of the lighthouse, the light burned on, keeping watch as it always had, as it had been built to do, on the flat black water of the Chesapeake Bay. The rain fell without agenda onto a surface that held nothing beneath it now but water and tide and the ordinary, uncursed dark. 17 men, held for 130 years in the cold of the bay by a dead man's spite and released at last by the sound of their own names spoken aloud into a storm, had gone wherever it is that the long waiting go when the waiting finally ends. And Edmund Harlow, keeper, faithful soul, the man who had stayed at his post for 70 years because that is what keepers do, had gone with them. Not lost, not taken, released, his lamp burning gently above the bay he had loved. His watch finally, completely, mercifully over. On the ledge below the black rocks, two people stood in the rain and did not speak for a long time. There was nothing that needed saying. Some moments are complete in themselves, and this was one of them. Speech balloon, they would go inside. They would dry off. They would sit by the wood stove until morning came, and in the morning they would drive to Creston Harbor and eat breakfast in the diner, and Elias would call the preservation office and tell them the assessment was complete. All of that would happen. But first, just for a little while longer, they stayed at the water's edge and let the rain fall and watched the gentle amber light in the lamp room above them burn steady and quiet against the storm. Some things deserve to be witnessed. They had learned that tonight better than they had ever learned anything. There was one thing left. One final morning in the lighthouse. One last thing the bay had not yet given up. Dawn came to Creston Harbor the way dawn comes after a hard night. Not triumphantly, not with the dramatic rose and gold of fair-weather mornings, but quietly, almost apologetically, a gradual gray lightening of the eastern sky that asked nothing and promised only that the dark was finished and the ordinary world was prepared to resume if you were willing. Elias became aware of it through the cottage window without remembering falling asleep. He was in the chair at the table, his head resting on his folded arms, the empty mug at his elbow, the wood stove burned to soft orange coals. The paper with the 17 names was still on the table in front of him. Damp from the rain, the ink slightly blurred at the edges, but legible. All 17 names still there, still readable, permanent as the fact of the men who had borne them. He sat up slowly and looked at the room. Maggie was asleep on her cot, buried under both blankets. One hand curled under her cheek with the uncomplicated abandon of someone sleeping deeply and without anxiety for the first time in days. Her breathing was even and slow. Her face, in the gray morning light, was entirely at peace. He looked at the ceiling. No footsteps, no knocking, no movement from the lamp room above, no sound from the iron stairs, no sensation of being listened to by the stones around him. The cottage was simply a cottage, cold, old, salt-bitten, needing work, blessedly and completely ordinary. He pressed both palms flat on the table and felt the grain of the old wood under his hands and breathed. Outside, the Chesapeake Bay was still. Not the terrible, recruited stillness of the night before, the stillness of something large holding its breath in preparation. This was the natural stillness of early morning water after a storm has passed. The bay lying flat and silver gray, its surface unmarked, its depths giving nothing away. Gulls were already working the shallows. A heron stood on the black rocks below the causeway with the patient, vertical dignity that herons maintain regardless of what has occurred in the night around them. In the harbor, just visible beyond the causeway's far end, the crab boats were beginning to move. The world had resumed. Elias built up the fire, put the coffee on, and sat for a while doing nothing more than watching the bay lighten as the dawn strengthened, letting the ordinary beauty of it move through him without analysis or interpretation. He had spent 2 days in this place trying to understand what it was holding and what it needed and how to give it that thing. Felt right now to simply look at it, to let it be what it was: water, sky, morning, the patient geography of a coastline that had been here long before any human story and would be here long after all of them were finished. Maggie woke at 7, surfacing from sleep with a long, slow breath and lying still for a moment with her eyes open, taking inventory of herself. Then she sat up and looked at Elias and said, with the directness that had always been her particular gift, "It's gone, isn't it? Not a question. A confirmation." "Yes," he said. She nodded, pushed her hair back from her face, looked at the wood stove, at the coffee, at the window and the morning bay beyond it. Then she looked at him with an expression he recognized, the one that meant she was about to say something true that she had been carrying since the night before. "I felt them leave," she said quietly. "When you said the last name, I felt all of it release, like a knot coming undone. And then I felt—" She paused, choosing words with care. "I felt him, Harlow, for just a second. Not frightening, just present, like when someone puts a hand on your shoulder to let you know they're there. And then he was gone too." Elias poured her coffee and said nothing for a moment. "Good," he said finally. "He deserved to go." "He did," she agreed. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "They all did." They spent the morning completing what the preservation office had actually sent Elias there to do, the structural documentation of Harlow Point Lighthouse, conducted now in the clear, clean light of a post-storm October morning that showed the old building in its fullest complexity. Elias moved through the lighthouse with his camera and clipboard, Maggie taking notes, and they worked with a thoroughness and a quiet attentiveness that felt, under the circumstances, like the right way to treat a place that had been through what this place had been through. The lamp room in daylight was extraordinary. The great Fresnel lens stood at the center like a jewel, not dark and ominous as it had seemed in the night, but magnificent, its hundreds of precisely ground glass prisms catching the morning light and doing what they had been built to do, refracting it, bending it, filling the circular room with a complex, ever-shifting pattern of brightness that moved across the walls as the sun moved outside. Elias stood in the center of it for a long time, turning slowly, watching the light move around him, and felt something he had not expected to feel in this room. Something uncomplicated and clean that he eventually identified as joy. The lens was still turning, slowly, barely perceptibly, but turning. The same movement that had begun the night before when Harlow appeared, still continuing in the clear morning air as if the mechanism, having found motion after 70 years of stillness, was reluctant to give it up again. Elias made a note in his documentation: lens mechanism, unexpectedly functional, requires assessment by specialist. Then he looked at the note and almost laughed. The lamp itself, the amber light they had seen burning from the rocks, was out. Of course it was out. There was no power supply to the lamp room, no functional electrical connection, no physical mechanism by which it could have burned. And yet, he touched the old brass housing of the lamp and felt, very faintly, a warmth that the morning sun alone could not account for. He noted this too. Then he moved on. It was in the documentation of the lamp room's lower wall section, running his hand along the stone to check for structural cracking, that his fingers found the recess. Small, deliberately cut, like the one beneath the cottage floorboard. Shallow, precisely shaped, sealed with a piece of fitted stone that came away cleanly in his hand as if it had been designed to be opened exactly like this, exactly once. Inside the recess was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. He stood very still for a moment. Then he unfolded it. The paper was not old. It was not yellowed or brittle or blurred with age. It was fresh, entirely, impossibly, undeniably fresh, white and crisp and clean, as if it had been placed there recently. Within the last day, within the last night, the handwriting on it was precise and angular, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was considered a mark of character. It was a hand he recognized from 3 logbooks read by lamplight over 2 long evenings. Edmund Harlow had left them a letter. Elias sat down on the lamp room floor, his back against the stone wall, the morning light moving around him in slow bright arcs from the turning lens, and he read, "To whoever found the names and spoke them, I do not have many words left or much time to spend them, so I will be direct in the way I was always direct, which my colleagues sometimes found abrupt but which I always believed was a form of respect. Thank you. I have been at my post for 70 years. I stayed because someone had to, and because it was right, and because the men beneath that water deserved at least one soul willing to keep company with them in the dark. I do not say this to claim credit. I say it because I want you to understand that I was not unhappy exactly. The bay is a good companion, and there is a particular kind of peace in doing a thing because it is right, even when it costs you everything else. But I am glad it is finished. I will not pretend otherwise. Thomas Wicks had a wife in Annapolis and 2 children, both girls. Samuel Cord was 22 years old and had never seen anything west of the Appalachians, which he planned to remedy the following spring. John Ferris kept a journal which was lost with him, which is the particular loss that pains me most. Robert Ames could play the fiddle. William Pruitt was the oldest among them at 51 and was working to pay a debt that was not his own, incurred by a brother who had since prospered and forgotten him. I could tell you something about each of them. I had 70 years to learn. What I want you to know is that they were real. Not victims, not symbols, not the 17 drowned. 17 men, each one the center of his own story, each one deserving of more pages than they got. You gave them the last page tonight. You said their names into a storm and the water heard, and something that had been clenched for 130 years finally opened. I cannot tell you what comes after. I am about to find out. I find I am not afraid, which surprises me less than I expected. Take care of the light. It has been dark too long. This bay has ships on it still, and ships need guidance, and lighthouses exist for exactly that purpose. Not for ghosts, not for curses, not for the settling of old debts, but for the simple, necessary, unglamorous work of keeping the living from the rocks. That is enough. That has always been enough. E. Harlow, Keeper, Harlow Point Lighthouse, October, in the year of the 70th tide. Elias sat on the lamp room floor and read the letter twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original lines and held it in both hands and looked out through the salt-hazed glass at the Chesapeake Bay, silver and broad and entirely ordinary in the October morning light. Maggie appeared in the lamp room doorway and looked at him. He held up the letter. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the floor, their backs against the stone wall, and he held the letter so they could both read it in the slow, moving light of the Fresnel lens. She read it without speaking. When she finished, she was quiet for a long time. The lens turned above them, throwing its patient arcs of refracted morning light across the walls, across the floor, across the two of them sitting together in a lighthouse that had been empty for 70 years and was empty no longer. "Robert Ames could play the fiddle," Maggie said finally, very quietly. "Yes," Elias said. "I'm going to remember that," she said. "I'm going to remember all of them." "So will I," he said. They left Harlow Point Lighthouse at noon. Elias locked the cottage door with a heavy iron key and stood for a moment on the causeway, looking back at the building in the full light of the October day. It looked different than it had when he arrived, not physically, not structurally, not in any way his documentation could quantify, but different in the way a room feels different after it has been cleaned, or a wound feels different after it has been properly treated. Something had been addressed. Something that had needed addressing for a very long time had finally received the attention it required, and the building knew it in whatever way buildings know things. The lamp room glass caught the noon sun and threw a brief, brilliant flash. Not the amber glow of the night before, not the blue-white of the offshore light, but simple sunlight reflected. Simple and ordinary and entirely exactly right. He put the key in his pocket to return to Pruitt, turned, and walked across the causeway toward the mainland with Maggie beside him, their footsteps on the wooden planks sounding over the quiet water below. He drove to old Vera's house on Coxfield Road before leaving town. She came to the door before he knocked, as the woman in the diner had said she would, and looked at him with her pale gray-green eyes and waited. "It's done," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the lighthouse, just visible above the marsh grass at the end of the lane, the lamp room catching the afternoon light. "I know," she said. "I could feel it this morning. The bay felt different." She looked back at him. "Did he leave you anything?" He took the letter from his inside pocket and held it out. She looked at it but didn't take it. "That's yours," she said. "He left it for you, not me." She paused. "Did he say anything about the men? The 17? "He knew them," Elias said. "All of them. He'd had 70 years. Something moved across Vera's face. Grief and relief in such close proximity they were almost indistinguishable. "Good," she said. "That's good. No one should go without someone who knows their name." She looked at him steadily for a moment, with the expression of someone who has carried a thing for a long time and is satisfied with how it was finally set down. "Go home, Elias Croft," she said gently. "You've done what you came to do." He nodded. He turned to go. "One more thing," Vera said behind him. He stopped. "The preservation office will get a proposal next month," she said, "to restore the lighthouse. Full restoration, the lamp, the mechanism, the keeper's cottage. There are people in this county who have been waiting to make that proposal for 20 years, waiting until it felt right." A pause. "It feels right now." Elias looked back at her. "Who will keep it?" Vera smiled, the first full smile he had seen from her, small and certain and carrying within it the satisfaction of someone who has lived long enough to see the right ending arrive. "Someone will," she said. "Someone always does." He drove north on Route 50 with Maggie in the passenger seat and the letter in his inside pocket and the 17 names on the damp paper folded beside it, and the Chesapeake Bay visible in intervals through the trees to his left, broad and silver and unheld, its surface moving with the ordinary, uncursed rhythms of wind and tide and the patient turning of the world. Maggie was asleep within 20 minutes, her head against the window, her face entirely at peace. Elias drove and thought about Edmund Harlow, who had loved this bay enough to stay with it for 70 years after death. About 17 men whose names had been taken from them and returned on a stormy October night by two people who had no particular reason to be there, except that one of them needed money and the other had decided to surprise her brother. About Captain Silas Doyle, who had spent 130 years holding on to something that was never his and had ended with nothing and less than nothing, dispersed into whatever the water gives back when it releases what it should never have been made to hold. About the difference between keeping and holding, between watching over something and refusing to let it go. He thought about Edmund Harlow's letter, about take care of the light. He thought that he might, when the restoration proposal came through, submit an application. He was not sure exactly when this thought arrived or precisely what form it took. It was less a decision than a recognition, the feeling of a thing already true becoming visible. He had studied old buildings because he believed they held things worth preserving. He had come to Harlow Point because he needed money and had no better option. He was leaving it because something had been finished, and because he was, perhaps, only beginning to understand what that finishing meant and what it might require of him going forward. The lighthouse was behind him now, invisible beyond the trees and the miles and the marshland. But he could still see the lamp room light when he closed his eyes, that gentle amber glow, burning quiet and steady against the storm, doing the simple, necessary, unglamorous work it had been built to do. It has been dark too long, Harlow had written. It would not be dark much longer. 3 weeks later, Elias Croft received an email from the Maryland Historic Preservation Office containing a restoration proposal for Harlow Point Lighthouse. He read it at his kitchen table in the early morning, coffee going cold at his elbow, and at the bottom of the proposal in the section marked additional notes, in a handwriting that was not that of anyone employed by the Preservation Office, in an ink that was slightly too brown, in a penmanship that was precise and angular and entirely familiar, were 3 words, "The light's yours." He called the number in the proposal header. He said yes before they finished explaining the position. He moved to Creston Harbor in November. The lamp at Harlow Point Lighthouse has been burning every night since. Some things can only be healed by being witnessed. Some wounds can only close when the names of those who suffered them are finally, fully, publicly spoken. Captain Doyle's power came not from evil alone but from erasure, from the theft of identity, of record, of remembrance. And what broke it was the opposite of that power. 2 ordinary people standing in a storm, saying 17 names out loud, insisting on the reality of 17 lives that greed had tried to make invisible. The lesson of Harlow Point is not about curses or ghosts or things that move in the water. It is about what we owe to those who came before us, about the fact that to be forgotten is its own kind of drowning, and about the extraordinary, underestimated power of simply saying, "I know your name. I know you were real. I remember you." Bravery is not the absence of fear. Honesty is not the absence of cost. And remembrance, true, deliberate, spoken aloud remembrance, is one of the most powerful forces in the human world. It is enough to break a century of darkness. It is enough to light a lamp that has been dark for 70 years. It is, in the end, enough. Clapperboard, thank you for watching Scary Folktales USA. If this story moved you, if it kept you up past midnight, if you found yourself saying the names quietly to yourself in the dark, then Edmund Harlow's 70 years of keeping watch were not spent in vain. Like and subscribe for more long-form American folk horror. And remember, the Bay remembers everything. So should we.